Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about our friend, the PSP, and the fact that, yes, it really has been 20 years since this thing came out. I know you feel old, I'm sorry, but we're going to have some fun anyway. But before we do, if you guys could do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, as well as check out all my social media stuff in the description. I've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, my Spreadshirt, travel channel. I appreciate the support on all those platforms. Thank you so much. Let's get into it. So, yeah, believe it or not, I've never actually done a video on the PSP, at least not to one that I recall. And this is certainly not the recap video. This is just kind of a let's fun, we're going to talk about it, memory lane type of video. I've actually done a lot of these recently just because it's been a very strange couple of weeks. So, like earlier this month, December 3rd, we had the 30th anniversary of the PS1. On November 22nd, we had the 30th anniversary of the Sega Saturn. November 21st was the 30th anniversary of the 32X. It was also the 20th anniversary of this thing's immediate competitor, the Nintendo DS. So it's just been kind of fun to talk about these things, and I think these are a pretty good excuse to do it. Now, I know we're going to get a little, well, I actually type of comments on this. This system came out on December 12th, 2004 in Japan. Now, that wasn't the global launch, obviously. It was just the first place it came out. Obviously, in North America, it came out a bit later, which plays into my own personal history with it. But that said, the system has existed for 20 years, and I just thought, this is a cool opportunity. Let's talk about it. So, yeah, the system ultimately goes on to be a moderate success. It sold like 85 million units or something, which was good. Like, by any other console manufacturer, that would be legendary, but to Sony, that was considered a little bit of a letdown. However, it was enough to justify the sequel, the PS Vita. That one only sold like 10 or 12 million units, something like that, and Sony has not made a portable system since. This is the most successful portable video game console ever made by anyone that wasn't Nintendo. That title had previously been held by the Sega Game Gear, but this thing blew that out of the water. However, as cool as it was, it did have issues, and there's the history of it, really, was the reason Sony got into it at all. As I'm sure you guys know, they had absolute success with the original PlayStation, but they didn't even think about competing with Nintendo in the portable space, because that was really just dominated by the Game Boy. And they had seen all these other people come and go and fail, like the Atari Lynx, obviously the Sega Game Gear, etc., etc. So basically, around this time, I guess somebody at Sony said, nah, man, we can do it. We can offer a better PlayStation experience. What we'll do is they basically tried to give you the PS2 in your pocket. In the sense that from a graphical, capable, standpoint, it was very similar to the PS2 as far as what that was putting out there. This thing was released when we all knew the PS3 was kind of coming up soon. So it kind of, looked like, okay, and eventually it would have compatibility with that system. And it also tried to, what Sony always does, they put their own formats in it. They put this thing called the memory stick that they owned, which was kind of, to be thought of kind of like an SD card competitor. And they also created the UMD, which was a little mini disc that was housed in a plastic caddy, and you would use that to play the games. So this was a strange thought. Now, the reason they did it, of course, was that discs are cheaper to manufacture, they can hold more space, etc. But I think with the PSP, one of the fundamental issues that Sony didn't really understand was that when people are playing games portably, they don't really want the home console experience on the go. They want the portable experience. Nintendo has mastered that. And I talked a bit about this in my DS video, which was basically, like, I think the perfect game on that system is Mario Kart DS for the exact reason that you just pop it in, you can start playing any level, you can turn it off really easily, it saves your data constantly, you just play for a few minutes, you get your entertainment. It offers you a very quick pick up and go experience, but also a very addictive one that also looks like it's utilizing the hardware pretty well, utilizing the unique features, is actually fun, but also doesn't demand persistent attention. Sony didn't seem to get that. They basically tried to give you the PS2 on the go. And to that end, the format they included with it as far as the UMD, they even created a movie format for that. I don't have any of them. I used to have Resident Evil and Spider-Man 2. I think actually I might have them somewhere in like a case. I don't pay much attention to that stuff, the movie formats of that, because they don't mean it. That's not how I would watch a movie, is really what I'm trying to say. So I think I have them like in a case back there somewhere, but that doesn't really matter. they created a movie format. I've actually seen people who have like whole sets of those things because they just like the idea of watching a movie that way. But I think that the reason that the UMD didn't take off is it was completely proprietary to this machine. So unlike the DVD, where if you bought it and put it in a PS2, you could also use a DVD on, you know, anything else that supported DVDs. But I don't know. And of course, this is before smartphones and streaming and all that sort of stuff. So there really was no other way to play that kind of stuff. So it seemed very cool. It did. Everything about the PSP seemed very cool, but a lot of it had just kind of little practical issues. Big, you know, console game experiences with load times on the go is not really what people wanted. And I think a large part of the success of the system, and while there was a lot of cool things about it, part of the reason I think it sold as many units as it did was, of course, it had the PlayStation name behind it when they were at the height of their success with the PlayStation 2. But also, obviously, a lot of those features really did get people's attention. Like, wow, I can watch a movie on the go. Wow, I can have these big, like, console games on the go. But then you kind of play them and you realize, like, I kind of want to play this on a television, which was really like one of my issues eventually. Sony eventually obviously recognized this because, like, here's the launch model of the system. This one you could only play on this. Eventually they heard what everybody was saying, that they really want to play these games on a TV. And so later models of the PSP would actually, while they doesn't look like anything special, they would actually have this link port at the bottom, and you could buy special like component cables that were proprietary for this thing, plug them into a TV, and then you could play the PSP on a screen, thus making it more appealing, but also sort of negating the whole point of the system. To the end where basically Sony said, okay, we're going to start mining some of the games out of this and we're going to port them to the PlayStation 2. Like, there were exclusive GTA games on this thing, like Liberty City Stories and Vice City Stories and so on and so forth, that eventually after they were here, they were kind of pilfered and brought over to the PS2 anyway. So a lot of the best gaming experiences didn't actually need to be played on the PSP. And eventually when the PS3 came out, they straight up built PSP emulation into that system, and they built cross-compatibility with it, so you could link the system together, and you did this thing, if anybody remembers this, called cross-buy, where if you bought like the PS3 version of a game, you would get like the digital PSP version and vice versa, and so on and so forth. So these days, it's really easy to play the PSP on anything other than the PSP itself, which we'll get back to. Apologies if you hear sirens. Now, what we're going to do here is, that's kind of the elevator pitch of its history. Let's talk about my own personal story with it. It's important to understand that when this system came out, it came out in North America a few weeks after this. I believe it came out in like January of 2005. At that point in time, I was a high school senior. So I really had, and I talked about this in my Nintendo DS video, I didn't have a whole lot of interest in video games at that time, even though I did. So you're at a weird age around then where you're being told, like, all right, everything you know, your whole life of going to school is about to end, and you're going to go off to this thing called college where you're expected to be very mature and be an adult, and then after that you're going to get a job and you're going to be in the workforce and you're doing all this stuff. So you just kind of feel that childhood naivete kind of ending. And around that phase, you start to feel like, I need to be more mature and get rid of all the things that I liked about being a kid. I never personally physically got rid of stuff, like a lot of people do, but I basically mentally did. I was like, all right, video games, I don't need to focus on that anymore. That's not that important. So I didn't really gravitate towards the PSP. And it should have worked. It should have been like, dude, that's the mature video game system. Look at all it's got, playing your movies, it's doing all this stuff. It just didn't really click with me. And the other thing is, as I was growing up around all people in the same age range, obviously, everybody else is going through it, so I didn't know anybody who had a PSP. And you see I've got a Blockbuster shirt on here. This is kind of important and relevant, is at that point in time, Blockbuster was pretty much on its way out. And so what I had known, along with a generation of us, was, hey, when the new system comes out, the way you play games, you can buy them yourself, which is obviously expensive. You can borrow from friends if they have the same system as you, which we just explained is out in the case of the PSP. Or you could go to Blockbuster and rent them and see if you like them. Well, Blockbuster, to my recollection, at least the ones around me, was not renting PSP games. Maybe some of them in the country were, I don't know, but the ones around me certainly weren't. In other words, if I wanted a PSP, there was absolutely no way to try the system or try the games without straight up buying it, and mixing that with the mentality of, I don't really want any video game stuff right now. That was never gonna click. So what ends up happening, though, I graduate high school, all that stuff's over. Now, it's like this, if I recall correctly, around the summer of 2006, I was already in college at this point. I had a buddy named Daniel. who I still do. He lives in North Carolina. Shout out if he's watching. If I recall correctly, around that time, Sony decided to reissue the PSP with a slightly different variant. One that got, because again, the launch models didn't have TV out, and I think that they were changing that. I don't remember exactly what the reasoning was or the timeline of that version of the system, but I do remember that around that time, Daniel comes to me and he's like, hey man, I got a PSP I don't want. Do you want to trade for it? And I was like, not really. And he's like, I'll offer you something cheap, man. I really just don't want this thing anymore. And I was like, why? What's wrong with it? He's like, there's nothing wrong with it. He's like, I just don't have any interest in it anymore. He's like, and I was like, well, what does it come with? He's like, just the system. And I was like, I don't have any use for that. He's like, no, you don't get it. It's hacked. And I was like, hacked? And this was kind of an interesting little, learning lesson for me. He was like, yeah. So basically what had happened by that point is if you had a low enough firmware on the system, people had figured out that with that magic card thing I was just talking about before, magic stick, magic gate is what it says there, but I think the actual stick was called the magic stick. People had figured out that if you just loaded games on that with a couple of the appropriate files, you could basically, on a hacked firmware, just boot games through that. And ironically, you actually eliminated the whole loading time issue was much better, etc. It's really kind of what Sony probably should have done initially, was just put games on cards, which I think they figured out, hence the Vita. But they were like, yeah, no, he was like, you could just do that, and then mine's already hacked, so you can just kind of have that. And I was like, well, that's more appealing, because then I could try whatever games I want, and if I like them, I can go out and buy them. So that kind of got me going. And at that point, I was now in college, so you kind of have that, all right, maybe, getting rid of or thinking about getting rid of games and stuff was stupid. I don't even know those high school people anymore. Why did I care what they thought? That type of thing. I'm sure you all went through it. But so he sends me this PSP. I sent him whatever I sent him, which was, I don't remember it being anything of any significance. And I get it, and I can't get it to work right away. Like, the system will power up, and I try to boot the games. I was like, how does this work? He's like, oh, you go here, you do this. And I was like, it's not doing anything. And he's like, oh, right, I forgot to tell you. You need at least one legitimate game in the slot on the back, the UMD slot. He's like, it can be any UMD, so it can be like a movie, it can be a game, it can be whatever. And I was like, why didn't you tell me that? He's like, I don't know, I forgot. And so I had to go over to a Game Crazy. Does anybody remember Game Crazy? I know I talked about this briefly in my DS video, but Blockbuster had a competitor very briefly called Hollywood Video. And Hollywood Video created a spin-off called Game Crazy, meant to compete with GameStop, neither of which are still around. Actually, all of those aren't around except GameStop, other than the one Blockbuster. But anyway, so I went over there and I was like, all right, I'll just buy like the cheapest game. It can be a sports game. It doesn't matter what it is. So I go in the store looking around, and PSP was still super relevant. So all the games were like 50, 60 bucks, whatever it was. And I was like, I'm a first year college student. I really didn't have the money to just be dumping on this. Especially because I had traded this effectively for peanuts. And I was just like, what do I do? Because I didn't want to spend the money. So I go up to the counter, especially for a game I wasn't even going to try and play. I just wanted it as a boot disc, effectively. So I go up to the counter, and I don't know why I did this, and the guy should have kicked me out for it. I basically told him straight up what I wanted one for, just I wanted a disc. And he should have kicked me out, but instead of doing that, he's like, oh yeah, okay. And from under the counter, he just pulls out this disc and puts it on the table. And I only just realized in setting up for this video, I still have it sitting in the caddy of this PSP. It's been sitting there for effectively 20 years. Well, more like 19. 18. But yeah, what he gives me is this. This was just the sampler disc PSP Volume 1. I guess this came bundled with certain variants of the system. It's just a demo disc, basically. But he just had spares. He's like, oh yeah, these are junk. He just gives it to me, and he's like, yeah, man, that's no problem. So he gives me that. I took it back. You put it in there, close it up. And then once I fired it up and I wanted to play games, they would work. And I thought this was like the coolest thing ever. And I'm sitting there playing it, and as I'm enjoying myself, I'm going like, I really wish I could play this on a TV. Like, that's just what kept coming back to my mind. It was like, this is cool. I wish I could play this on a TV. And so that, unfortunately, that definitely stayed with me. And we know that I wasn't alone in that, because again, Sony changed it themselves to the point where TV output became a standard of the PSP. So much so that when the Nintendo Switch launched, I remember people in the comments arguing that this is not a new feature because the PSP always did this. Little did they remember, no it didn't. The PSP for a long time did not do that. That became a retroactive feature later. They also released the PSP Go model at one point, which was a horrible failure because it was a digital-only, online-only version of that platform, which was a spectacular failure. But I do have the later model of the PSP as well. This is the kind that actually can connect to a TV. Shout out if they still watch this channel. This was given to me by a couple of Canadian guys. It was Mike and Julian. They donated this to me like, I don't know, 12 years ago when I was at a store called Toy Rat in Milton, Ontario. And they were just like, oh yeah, we want you to have this. So I've got it. Still here, guys, if you're still watching the channel. But, so yeah, I got some cool PSP stuff. But I think the most use I ever really got out of this thing, if I remember correctly, is that shortly after that, Daniel had found more of his PSP stuff. You know, he had found, like, he had Resident Evil 1 on UMD, Spider-Man 2 on UMD, hence I have them now. And he had one game for it that he'd ever actually bought. And he just decided, because he didn't have the PSP anymore, he didn't want any of this stuff, so he just sent it to me as a little care package. If I recall correctly, I still have those two. Spider-Man and Resident. I'm pretty sure they're like hidden away in there somewhere. I don't. They're UMD movies, so I don't really care where they go. Whereas games, I take more care of, if that makes sense. But he did give me one game, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about the games now. So the game he gave me was Medieval Resurrection. Now, I played this a bit. I was more familiar with the PS1 Medieval game. That's the one I had spent the most time with. I wasn't even really aware that there was a Medieval game on PS1. This is, since there's more games now, there's the Medieval remake on PS4, etc. It's actually a pretty decent game, but again, it was just that same vibe of, as I'm playing it, I'm thinking, this would be much better on a television, as opposed to playing it on this tiny little screen. But I guess where I'm jumping ahead a little bit, because I will keep talking about the games, but the reason I brought all that up is that I had these couple of movies, right? And at that point, because the system was hacked, I had also figured out you could play like AVI and MP4. I don't even know if it was MP4 at that point. I think it was mostly AVI format videos on the thing through the SD card, not the SD card, the Magic Gate cart, whatever it is, Magic Stick, Memory Stick. And I remember the most use I ever got out of this thing was that in 2006, the Wii and the PS3 had not launched yet. But Microsoft, in an attempt to kind of jump on them a bit, had created what was called the Xbox 360 Elite, which was an all-black version of the original, like, hourglass, fat 360. And it came with an HDMI port natively on board, because the launch models did not have that. And it also had a bigger hard drive. I think instead of 20 gigs, it was like 120 gigs. And so I really wanted that. So I remember, going to, again, Game Crazy, I think it was actually the same one, and being like, are you guys going to have that? They're like, yeah, manager only ordered 2, though. So it's like literally, we're not doing pre-order, so it's literally the first 2 people that are here are going to be able to get that. And I really wanted it, and I knew that was going to be hard to get, so at the time anyway. So I was like, okay, here's what I'm going to do. So the night before the launch, I basically asked them, like, would anything preclude me from just coming here the night of and just sitting here all night waiting for that? And they were like, if you want to do that, that's your choice. So I did. So I ended up driving out. I parked my car in front of Game Crazy, and I decided, okay, what do I do? I'm just going to pull an all-nighter here in the parking lot. What do I do? And basically, the only thing I could think of at that point, because you got to remember, smartphones weren't a thing, the only thing to kind of appease myself and amuse myself was the PSP. So I had loaded it with a bunch of games, I had loaded it with a bunch of movies, like I brought the 2 that he had, and I remember sitting there actually trying to watch Resident Evil on this thing, and then it dawned on me that I didn't like watching movies on it, because I am a film guy, believe it or not. Even though I don't care about those 2 particular formats, I care a lot about like Blu-ray and video preservation and stuff like that. And this killed me because I actually have a film degree. I don't even know if you guys know that. I went to Columbia College, Chicago. So I'm watching Resident Evil on this thing, and one of the first things it basically tells you is like, oh, by the way, this is not the original aspect ratio of the film. It's been formatted for the PSP screen, which it was immediately like, no. They tried to crop movies to best fit the 16:9 dimension of this screen, which I was not in favor of. So I tried doing that with some of the movies I had brought. I put some stuff on memory sticks where they were less, you had more control over the aspect ratio and stuff like that. And I tried to play some games. And I remember, like, I was having a decent enough time, but it just wasn't great. And ultimately the battery died anyway, and I had no way to recharge it. And it was like, So that was like the best nice memory I have of it. And I meant that positively, even though it sounds like a negative story. It did get me through that night of waiting for this other thing. And then eventually, when I wanted to go back and play some of the games, I had since now had one that connected to the TV. And of course, emulation of the thing got easier, not only in a hacked version, but you could also, like I said, Sony built the PS3 kind of with PSP compatibility in mind. So, like, I don't even know if any people remember this, but, like, the cross-menu bar that's most associated with the PlayStation 3, it originates in something called the PSX, which was a PS2 DVR only released in Japan. But the PSP also used that same cross-menu bar, or XMB. And so they wanted that ecosystem to kind of function together. So because of the cross-compatibility and all that, even on a hacked PS3 now, you can run PSP games relatively easily. And for the most part, they tend to work just fine. So, you know, most of my PSP gaming experiences have not really been on the PSP itself. So like Medieval, for example, when we're talking about that, that's why I like remember it, but I don't remember it that well. But we have a few other games here that I want to talk about. And I should mention, though, like, I didn't buy a whole lot of games for this system. I have a few more than this, but this is about it. Because, like, it just came out at kind of the wrong time for me mentally, as far as, like, what I was going to care about. And as I said, once I had one, I didn't really need to buy the games because I was just trying to test them out. And I never found that game that really made me need the PSP. You know what I'm trying to say? Like Super Mario 64 DS made me need a DS. Mario Kart DS made me understand the value of a DS. But the PSP, I always just thought, this is great. It would be much better on a TV. And I'm sure a lot of you disagree with that, but that's just my opinion. So let's talk about some of the other games we do have here to talk about. Resistance, Retribution. I remember the PS3 versions of this a lot better. So obviously, Resistance Fall of Man was a big launch title for the PS3. It was supposed to be the Halo killer and all that sort of stuff. And then that franchise went on to have a few games. It did have a side spin-off game for the PSP. I don't remember it that well. I remember it being kind of amusing, but that's honestly, it's kind of all I remember about it. But this was a perfect example of a game that was just a little too complex for a portable, but there it was all the same. We got a brother-sister situation here. We got Star Wars Battlefront Elite Squadron and Star Wars Battlefront Renegade Squadron. I actually got these this year. These are my first PSP pickups in a very long time. And the reason I got them is I'm a huge fan of Star Wars Battlefront, the original game, as well as the sequels. Not the EA ones, the original LucasArts ones. And there was a Star Wars Battlefront 3 in development by LucasArts. We know now that game was mostly like 98, 99% complete, supposedly, for the 360 at the very least. I don't know about a PS3 build. But the game was ultimately canceled. It was meant to be released alongside these two games. And these two games were kind of built with the atmosphere of that game. So there's like levels in here that were meant for that game, and they were just kind of reused assets, or what was intended to be reused assets that ironically only saw the light of day on these versions. And so I have not actually sat down and played these in any extensive amount of time, but this is kind of the closest we'll ever get to that original Star Wars Battlefront 3 experience that I always wanted, unless the Xbox 360 prototype leaks at some point. We know it exists. We know it was very far along. I even have a hacked 360, but because the files aren't out there, I can't try it. I would love to, but I can't. But that said, you know, this is why I have these, and I want to play them on a television. But the one game that really drew me to the system, that had that potential to really win me over, and I have it here, is Twisted Metal Head-On. I love Twisted Metal stuff, or at least I used to. Twisted Metal 1 is the reason I got a PS1. Twisted Metal 2 was one of my favorite games of all time. Twisted Metal 3 broke my heart and made me realize games actually could be bad, a concept I had never understood until that moment. Twisted Metal 4 made me indifferent. Twisted Metal Black made me go, oh my god, the PS2 has a game. You know, like that, it meant a lot. Twisted Metal Small Brawl was just a reminder that the PS1 still existed. And then Twisted Metal the remake for PS2 in 2012 just made me go, what'd they do to my boy? But this game, I really wanted to see what this was, because this clearly was like, when you look at it and you see the footage and you play it a little bit, you realize this is kind of the Twisted Metal Black sequel we never got. And so I really wanted to check it out. And I tried playing it portably, and I actually really liked it. I actually was having a lot of fun with it, and I was just like, all right, I'm going to put some time into this as soon as I can. Then they announced a PS2 version. Much like I said with the GTA, Liberty City Stories, and Vice City Stories, they started just pilfering some of the best games and then moving them over to the PS2. So then I was like, all right, I'll get that version instead because I want to play it on a television. Now, you got to remember, when I was younger, I didn't have the version that had component output. In fact, I didn't even know that was a feature for years. But yeah, so this would probably be my favorite game on it, which doesn't speak too well of my experience with it just because I didn't spend a whole lot of time with it. But that said, I still think it's a very cool system. There's actually some games I would love to have just for the collection, like the Power Stone collection, which is going down in value now because I know those games are getting reissued on the Switch, I think. But it would be cool to have those. I love them on the Dreamcast, but again, I would play them on the Dreamcast. Another one I would really like to get is Assassin's Creed Bloodlines, because that game is, if I recall correctly, is actually exclusive to the PSP and has never been re-released on anything else. I like Assassin's Creed, especially in that era, so it'd be kind of cool to have that. But you know, honestly, that's kind of it. I do not deny there's a bunch of great games on this system, but as I said, and I keep repeating ad nauseum, the general consensus was just, it would be cool to play this on a television. And I think that really came to bite Sony with the Vita, because they didn't seem to learn that lesson. And so with the Vita in particular, they gave you a lot of really cool games that you could only play on the Vita. And then when they tried to do the TV out thing with like the PS Vita TV, it was only compatible with like half the games, and that made people upset, and you know, so on and so forth. So it's just, and now they're out because they were trying to give you too many complex experiences. You got to give Nintendo credit here because they understood that. And when it came to the Switch, they're like, how do we not fall into that same trap? The cartridge element of it, if you want to call it that, was easy enough. But they figured out that rather than say, oh, by the way, TV output is a retroactive bonus feature only available in certain models, they instead programmed us with the Nintendo Switch to say, hey, you can play anything portably or on a television. If the experience is too complex for you, not a problem. There's a dock. They all come with it. You just go straight from that to that, plug it in. Now you're playing on the TV. You can do that. Oh, you think this might work portably? You want to continue your game in bed or whatever? No problem. Just take it out, put it in the controllers, continue. They did not make this experience nearly as seamless, and it's not their fault. It's just, you know, I think Nintendo learned a lesson that Sony that didn't learn from themselves, if that makes any sense. So these days, if you want to pick up a PSP, it's a cheap system. I actually see them in Japanese junk bins all the time. There is a problem, though, and this is kind of an amusing story. The batteries on these things are famously bad. Not like they don't hold the charge well, they actually fail. Like I have one right here in front of me and it is swelled. This PSP, and here's a fun fact, I actually have a third one. That PSP, this happened to all of the batteries. I had to remove all of them. In fact, one of them I didn't have to remove. It happened for me. A couple of years ago, I remember sitting here and I was like editing or something, and in the other room I just hear a and I was like, what was that? And I come out and I don't see anything. Like I didn't see anything fall over, anything weird stuff. I was digging around for quite some time before I eventually figured out what it was. There was the other PSP was in the back, and of course there's a battery case, like piece of plastic here over where the battery actually goes. And as these things have been swelling, it was applying more and more pressure to the door. And as it applied more and more pressure to the door, eventually it just got to a point the door couldn't resist it anymore. And the door just popped off. Now, surprisingly, the plastic didn't break. Once I took the battery out, I was able to click it right back in and it was fine. But it was weird. And this has happened to every single one of my PS. I took the other batteries out kind of because of that. This one, if you touch it, you can just feel that it's swelled. Now, to my understanding, there is a company now making better PSP batteries that are replaceable. Fortunately, Sony didn't hard integrate them, so you can just easily remove them. But yeah, that's something to keep in mind. Check your PSP's battery. So certainly this battery doesn't work, and I wouldn't even consider trying it. Until legitimately, I didn't think until this moment. I don't know if you can power up the PSP without a battery in it, even if you're just using the power supply. I legit don't know, but it doesn't really matter. But anyway, so that's my thoughts really quickly on the PSP. It has had a little bit of an indie scene, but not a huge one. But it's a cool system, platform, whatever you want to call it. So if you can, I would suggest today, take out your PSP if you've got one, put in a game or two, or you know what, play it on a TV. If you got a PS3, it's also a very good way to do it. There's some really cool gaming experiences on there that were basically unique to the system, and I do feel they're worth revisiting, but on a TV. Anyway, so that'll do it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any great stories about your experience with the PSP or anything like that, I'd love to hear them. Put them in the description, or not the description, in the comment section. So leave a comment, like the video, subscribe if you've never done that before, and then check out all my social media stuff that is in the description. I've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, appreciate the support over there, Spreadshirt, my travel channel. I appreciate the support on all those platforms. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all later.